Chapter 15. Straight Out of Doom. As gamers came, Reb Doomer wasn't unique. He loved first-person shooters, especially Doom and Quake. He stayed up late at night, deathmatching over the internet. He made amateurish mods, an arena space based on a hockey rink, a boxing ring for hand-to-hand combat, and traded them with friends online. "What's up, all you Doomers out there?" he typed to them. "Reb here, bringing you another kick-ass Doom 2 WAD. This one took a damn long time to do, so send me some bloody credit, man." Offline, he wasn't finding much camaraderie at all. He was deeply troubled at school. The jocks, the jokes, the feeling of being a pariah. He began keeping increasingly angry journals, venting his desires for revenge. Finally, one day he set up a video camera in his basement, then sat in a reclining chair holding a bottle of Jack Daniels and a sawed-off shotgun in his lap. Looking into the camera, he described his plan to go on a shooting spree through his high school. "It's going to be like fucking Doom," he said. "Tick, tick, 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 ha! That fucking shotgun is straight out of Doom." On the morning of April 20th, 1999, Eric, Reb Doomer, Harris, and his best friend, Dylan Valcad Kelbold, strapped themselves with bombs and shotguns and went on a rampage through their little town, Colorado school, Columbine High, leaving 15 people, including themselves, dead. The event, which played out on live television, galvanized the country. Parents, teachers, politicians, and children wanted to make sense of the ultimate senseless act. They were looking for something to blame. At 5:15 p.m. on April 21st, 1999, Steve Heslip, the editor of a game news site called Blues News, uploaded a message. Several readers have written in reporting having seen televised news reports showing the Doom logo on something visible through clear bags containing material said to be related to the suspected shooters. There is no word yet of what connection anyone is drawing between these materials and this case. As the killers' Doom books, Doom games, and Doom fantasies surfaced, the connection was made soon enough. In the weeks following the tragedy, Doom became emblematic of how violent media were inspiring real-life violence. The Simon Wiesenthal Center issued a report suggesting that Eric Harris had reconfigured Doom in a dry run of the real-life killings. Similarly, without substantiation, others began reporting that Harris had created a mod based specifically on Columbine High. The Washington Post described the world of Doom deathmatching as a dark, dangerous place. Newsday wrote about how playing Doom can widen the hole in any kid's soul. David Grossman, a former Army Ranger, became a media darling for his views on games as murder simulators. Even President Clinton chimed in, quoting Grossman in a radio address and adding that Doom, the very game played obsessively by the two young men who ended so many lives in Littleton, makes our children more active participants in simulated violence. Once again, violent games and their associated pop culture, black clothes, heavy metal, gory films, were under attack. The mayor of Denver asked promoters to cancel a concert by Harris and Kelbold's alleged favorite band, Marilyn Manson. Schools banned trench coats. Disney World and Disneyland pulled violent games from their arcades. But none took the call to arms like the senator who had initiated the country's first investigation into violent games 6 years earlier. Senator Joseph Lieberman. In an April 28th statement, he called for a new investigation into the scourge. "My hope," he said, "is that such a summit would persuade the nation's top cultural producers to call a ceasefire in the virtual arms race. to stop the release of ultra-violent video games and movies and CDs that romanticize and sanitize extreme forms of violence and teach our children that killing is cool. The very material such as Doom, that several of the school gunmen murderously mimicked down to the choice of weapons and apparel. Without any sensible counterpoint, the press and politicians, many of whom had never played such games, were left to draw their own conclusions. Ellen Goodman, in her nationally syndicated column, asked, "How many of us accept, as normal boy stuff, the video games that we're now told are virtual training sessions for military desensitization?" She didn't seem to know or care that the military didn't use the games to desensitize. They used them for team building. Good Morning America corralled a friend of the teenage killers who led the viewers through a game of Doom. "There's more to learn from Eric Harris's computer game," the reporter intoned. "Watch closely as we enter the secret rooms he created." There were bodies hanging from the ceiling, images, he implied, that Harris had created. In fact, they were the original B-movie effects of the game. "This is like walking through somebody's nightmare," the reporter declared. "Did it ever strike you that, hey, this is a little strange? This guy really likes all this blood and shooting and violence?" His friend replied, "Never. He was just a gamer." And these were just games. It was an obvious point among the people who actually played Doom and Quake, but one that seemed strangely to elude everyone else. Games were make-believe. In video games, no one really got hurt. But when it came to violent play, people had a history of linking fantasy with reality. As the author Jared Jones explored in his book, Killing Monsters, while children need fantasy, superheroes, and make-believe violence. As Jones noted, an influential study in 1963 found that children who watched films of a person punching an inflatable clown doll later beat up such a clown toy more aggressively than kids who hadn't watched the film. The conclusion? Exposure to violent media caused real-life violence. In reality, of course, the kids were just punching inflatable clowns. They were not running to the local circus and pummeling Bozo. Rather than blame violent media, Jones argued, adults needed to understand the role make-believe violence plays in human development. Exploring in a safe and controlled context what isn't possible or too dangerous or forbidden is a crucial tool in accepting the limits of reality. Playing with rage is as valuable a way to reduce its power. Being evil and destructive in imagination is a vital compensation for the wildness we all have to surrender on our own way to being good people. Researchers since the 1980s had been finding positive effects of video games. A report in the Journal of American Academic Child Psychiatry argued that games not only didn't inspire aggression, they released it. An academic study in England would find that gamers seemed able to focus on what they were doing much better than other people and also had better general coordination. Overall, there was a huge similarity with top-level athletes. The skills they learned on computers seemed to transfer to the real world. In Finland, researchers used computer games to help treat children with dyslexia. And despite all the studies that attempted to link violent media with aggression, the conclusions remain suspect. Violence in film and video games and music lyrics is disturbing to us all. Dr. Stuart Fischoff, founder of the Media Psychology Lab at California State University in Los Angeles, said in an address to the American Psychology Association later in 1999. But because two phenomena are both disturbing and coincident, in time does not make them causally connected. There is not, I submit, a single research study which is even remotely predictive of events like the Columbine massacre. Murderers, after all, had proven that they could find inspiration in anything. The White Album, Taxi Driver, Catcher in the Rye? How many acts of violence had the Bible inspired? After Columbine, however, few had the nerve or the knowledge to defend games. John Katz, a writer for Rolling Stone and the tech community Slashdot, posted several essays that assailed the media stereotypes of geeks and gamers. "This is so crazy and hysterical," he told the San Francisco Chronicle. "The real issue should be how teenagers get their hands on machine guns and bombs, not about a website and video games." Others offered backhanded defense at best. "Violence has always been a big thing in the U.S., wrote Time, and there are good constitutional reasons why we can't legislate that out of our own entertainment products. But the video game industry makes only what it can sell, and as long as gore is what we're buying, for our kids and for ourselves, gore is what they'll give us." The politicians, however, weren't going to wait for the people to decide matters for themselves. Sam Brownback, a Republican from Kansas, made a speech on the Senate floor saying, "The video game Quake, put out by id Software, the same company as the producer of Doom, consists of a lone gunman confronting a variety of monsters. For every kill, he gets points. As he advances in the game, the weapons he uses grows more powerful and more gory. He trades in his shotgun for an automatic and later gets to use a chainsaw on his enemies. The more skilled the player, the gorier the weapons he gets to use. Bloodshed is his reward." By June 1999, the White House had stepped up to the plate. During a press conference in the Rose Garden, a dour-faced President Clinton stood holding up an ad from a gaming magazine that promoted as a game as more fun than shooting your neighbor's cat. "We ought to think twice," he said, "about the impact of ads for so-called first-person shooter video games. Like the recent ad for a game that invites players to, and I quote, get in touch with your gun-toting, cold-blooded, murdering side." With that, he ordered a federal investigation to determine whether gaming and other entertainment companies were guilty of marketing violent products to children. The industry's assertions that games were being made, in part, by and for adults didn't ring true. "It's hard to argue with a straight face that games were made for adults in the first place," he said. 3 days later, Senators Lieberman and John McCain announced a solution: the 21st Century Media Responsibility Act, a formidable bill that would establish a standardized rating system for movies, music, and video games. If the bill passed, retailers who sold violent games to minors would face $10,000 fines. No one in the games industry opposed ratings. They already had their own voluntary entertainment software rating board. But of course, they bristled at standardization and government involvement. The message from Washington was loud and clear: rethink violent games, or else. It was 1:34 a.m. in Suite 666, days after the Columbine shootings. Carmack sat at his desk behind the black windows in the black night, cursor blinking on his computer, awaiting a response. He thought over his words carefully. Writing his .plan updates was becoming increasingly laborious because, as Carmack knew, everyone seemed to be hanging so much on what he said. "Some of you," he finally typed, "are busy getting all bent out of shape about this." Carmack was talking about the gaming community's reaction to id's announcement that the first test of their next game, Quake 3 Arena, would be released for Macintosh, not Windows. In the gaming world, this was usually as big as the controversies got. But while Carmack turned his attention to his plan, describing the pros and cons of the new Macintosh systems, he couldn't avoid the other controversy. Finishing his update, he pushed himself away from his desk and walked down the hall to get a Diet Coke and a snack. "Hey," he said, passing the police officers in his lobby, "do you guys want anything to eat?" The cops were the most obvious sign of Columbine's impact on id. They had been hired to stand guard shortly after the first wave of hate calls and hate mails started flaming into the office. Miss Donna, receptionist and id mom, would pick up the phone to find a raging protester on the other end of the line asking what in God's name this company had done. Soon, there were journalists hanging around outside, trying fruitlessly to get a word from one of the many long-haired guys walking from their sports cars into the jet-black cube. After a hateful protester was found outside screaming, a few of the newer members of the id staff pleaded for security during the late hours. Carmack and the other owners relented, but felt it was an overreaction. "Oh," they said, "this happens all the time." In fact, it had happened only 8 days before the Columbine shootings. On April 12, 1999, the parents of 3 students killed in a 1997 school shooting in Paducah, Kentucky, had leveled a $130 million lawsuit against entertainment companies, including id Software, whose violent products, they said, had inspired the 14-year-old murderer Michael Carneal, a fan of Doom and Quake. And, of course, it had happened long before that, the Wolfenstein controversies in 1992, the Mortal Kombat hearings in 1993, the Doom bans to follow, not to mention the Death Race arcade outrage in the 1970s, or the Dungeons & Dragons hysteria in the 80s. As long as these guys had played games, there had been the detractors, the lawsuits, the sensationalism, but nothing quite as powerful as the 1-2 punch of Paddock and Columbine. Because of the Paddock lawsuits, id lawyers strongly advised the owners and employees to remain quiet. The staff obliged, but Carmack felt frustrated that he couldn't tell the world what he thought. As a result, the media storm brewed and brewed, with no word from people who had made the games. But Carmack knew exactly what he would say. The succession of the 2 events did not necessarily mean that something more significant was happening or the trend was increasing. It was just the odds. This life event, like every other, could be broken down to mathematics. If you've got any event that has this random chance of happening, eventually after a certain time, there are going to be multiple occurrences of it quickly after another. Carmack wasn't worried that there was suddenly going to be some secret link exposed between games and murder. Disturbed people are disturbed people, pure and simple. id's games weren't really about killing someone. Carmack knew they were just extension of childhood play. Deathmatch was tag, he said. Doom was cowboys and Indians with better special effects. We build games that we think are going to be fun. All the games we enjoyed, like Defender and Robotron, were all about running around and blasting things. The gore and graphics just make an already challenging and interactive game more visceral. It makes people jump and sweat and be tense. It's an okay game if you're sitting saying, okay, this is fun. But our definition of a good game is something that's going to be gripping and exciting. Were these violent games being marketed to kids? Of course teenagers like our games, Carmack said. To say that our games are targeted only for 18-year-olds and older is ludicrous. But the thing that people weren't getting, he thought, was that id wasn't targeting anyone. All the way back to Softdisk, they had made games not for an audience, but for themselves. They made games they wanted to play that no one else was making. Games that, as fate would have it, would appeal to millions of others. As Carmack returned to his desk, he went back to work on a game that was going to be id's most gleeful shooter yet, Quake 3 Arena. But after Columbine, would people want, would the market allow, his or Romero's games again? John Schooneman gripped his bowling ball tighter as he turned to Doom. Romero's stepfather, now in his 60s, had been coming to this bowling alley more frequently since retiring, and he could usually count on relaxing with a good game. But not today. The people next to him, like millions across the country, were talking about the horrific events at Columbine High School. Kids today, they're being corrupted by these violent video games like Doom. Schoonerman's heart raced again as they spoke. He stepped over to the group. "We can take it outside any time you want," he said, curling the ball at his side. He didn't want to hear any more trash about Johnny's games. He wasn't the only one. Romero himself couldn't believe the way people were harping on Doom, a game that was 6 years old. It just showed how clueless the politicians had become. It was just the same old crap from the same old people, and Romero was tired of the blame. Those kids were defective, he thought, so don't blame it on my game. Don't blame the games. Blame the fucking parents. From his own experience, of course, Romero had strong opinions about just how parents could screw up their kids. And now, at the age of 31, with 3 kids of his own, he had become more self-aware of where the violence in his games came from and the effect the violent games could have. He was a fucked up kid making fucked up games to deal with the fucked up physical and emotional violence he'd experienced when he was young. He liked the violence in his games, just as he liked the violence in his Melvin comics. There was no question. The violence in his games did have an impact on him at least. He'd scream and curse and break keyboards, but he never confused fantasy and reality. He didn't even know how to fire a gun in real life. But because he thought violence in games could have an effect, Romero thought that even more responsibility should rest with the parent. For that reason, he supported ratings on games, as did most of his peers. Ultimately, the responsibility shouldn't be the game makers or the politicians. The parents should decide when their kids were mature enough to play a game like Doom. Romero had long relished the day he could sit down with his boys, Stephen and Michael, and play through the worlds he created. They were ready for that day, Romero decided, when they were 8. After Columbine, though, Romero kept these opinions to himself. He wasn't being sued like id, but why say anything anyway? You talk to journalists, and they're going to take what you say and twist it any way they want into their story, and it will only end up looking bad. The last thing Romero wanted was more bad press. Even before Columbine, after all, he'd be getting more than his share. The avalanche of trash talking in the press and in the community broke the moment this 8 members of the Daikatana team, or as they became known, the Ion 8, had walked out Ion Storm's emerald doors a few months earlier, in November 1998. No sooner did Romero lose the core of his team than the news broke that the Ion 8 had formed a new company, Third Law, which was under contract to create first-person shooter based on the rock band Kiss for the Gathering of Developers, the independent-minded publisher started by Mike Wilson after his departure from Ion Storm. It was a double slap to Romero's face. He felt backstabbed by Mike and burned by the team he trusted. It was like the softest mutiny in which Romero and the rest had jilted Al Vacuvius. Only this time, Romero was the boss getting screwed. But Romero, as usual, didn't wait long to change moods. And this time, he had someone help speed his recovery, Stevie Case. Throughout all the darkness at the company, Stevie had been a beacon. They had much in common. 2 misfit kids who found a home in the fantasy life of video games. And, like Romero, Stevie had radically reinvented herself. Inspired by Ion Storm's creative atmosphere, the small-town girl with the student government bob had transformed her image. She stopped eating meat, went to the gym, lost 50 pounds, bleached her hair. She ditched the sweatshirts for midriffs, the baggy jeans for leopard pants. She used her video game salary to buy breast implants. In the space of a year, she had gone from model tomboy to Playboy model. The magazine, hearing her story, paid her to pose. After the Ion 8 left, she became Romero's lead designer. She also became his girlfriend. Just as he engaged to get Ion back on track, he separated from his wife, Beth. not long after she had given birth to their daughter, Lilia. Once again, Romero had grown dissatisfied with his marriage and overwhelmed by the pressures of being a rich person and game god. After all the years of assuring everyone, his fans, his friends, his family, that he could do it all, he had finally realized he could not manage both an empire and a family. His ex-wife, Kelly, had made this point clear when, to Romero's dismay, she moved back to California with his boys. Ultimately, he gave in to the truth. He was married to his games. With Stevie, the first woman in his life who shared the passion, it was a three-way affair. As his personal life changed, Romero put his energy into rebuilding his team, hiring a few old friends, and picking up some help from Tom Hall's squad. Though Daikatana was in need of an overhaul, the end was in sight. The Quake 2 engine conversion was complete, they announced in early January 1999. A producer Romero had hired to organize Daikatana proudly told the press that, "Come hell or high water, the game will be done on February 15th, 1999. Or so the team hoped. Days later, they would receive the worst blow of bad press yet. A scathing cover story called Stormy Weather in the city's free weekly paper, the Dallas Observer. The 7,000-word story explicitly detailed how the place where the designer vision is king has turned into a toxic mix of prima donnas and personality cults. More shocking, the article was based on internal emails. They now appeared in print and online for the entire world to read. The result, inside and outside the company, was devastating. Suddenly, all of Ion's internal affairs, from Mike Wilson's BMW financing to Romero's interest in burning through Eidos options, was public. Internet sites traded the story as fast as doomed shareware, revealing in how the surgeon of deathmatch, the one who was going to make them his bitch, was finally getting his due. Romero tried fitfully to determine the source of the leak. He blocked access to the game gossip sites, and even though unsuccessfully, to sue the Observer to reveal its sources. All he found was that his partner, Todd Porter, had accidentally posted his email file on the company computer network, and that anyone within Ion could have copied them. By the time the Columbine blow came, a few months later, Romero couldn't have been beaten down any worse. His company was a laughingstock. His game was once again delayed with no end in sight, having sailed past the promise for a February 1999 release. It now was in danger of buckling to technology once and for all. With id Software already deep into the Quake 3 engine. When a deathmatch demo of Daikatana was released in March, gamers thought it looked dated. The dream of the big company seemed to be proving too big after all, too loose, too high, too ambitious. All those things Carmack had berated him about, the hyperbole, the lack of focus, the dangers of a large team, had come back with a vengeance. Even Eidos, Romero's publisher, agreed. In return for their sinking by now nearly $30 million into the company, Romero had to change his ways once and for all. As the Eidos president, Rob Dreyer, put it, "Shut up and finish the game." id Software was once again in the spotlight at the E3 convention in Los Angeles in May 1999, but this time for all the wrong reasons. Coming only 1 month after the Columbine shootings and the Paducah lawsuit, the show became a feeding ground for the media's increasingly sensational investigation of video game violence. Of all the companies the reporters wanted to interview, there was none higher on the list than the creator of Doom and Quake. This wasn't going to be easy. No one, it seemed, wanted to talk to about the events. In his opening remarks, Doug Lowenstein president of the Interactive Digital Software Association, the group that was created in response to Senator Lieberman's 93 hearings on game violence, tried to set the tone. He pointed out that only 7% of the 5,000 games released were violent enough to be rated mature. Nevertheless, he added, the games industry was in fact growing up. This was not for kids. The IDSA reported that 54% of video gamers were over 18, with 25% of those older than 36. The age of computer gamers was even higher, with 70% over 18 and 40% of them over 36. Together, U.S. gamers were spending nearly $7 billion that year alone, more than Americans spent on movie tickets. For those of you who are here to focus on violence, Lowenstein said, I submit that you're missing a much bigger story about what it is that makes interactive entertainment the fastest growing entertainment industry in the world. The reporters responded by rushing over to id's booth for comments on Columbine, to no avail. Any journalist who muscled up to one of the gamers from id was abruptly intercepted by a PR representative, who would refer him or her to the publisher, Activision, who would refuse to say anything at all. These weren't the only gamers lying low. Raven, id's old friends from Wisconsin, showed their violent shooter, Soldier of Fortune, only behind closed doors. The same was true for one of the year's other hotly anticipated shooters, Kingpin. For id, however, the controversy was the least of their difficulties. With Quake 3 Arena, the game that they had come to demonstrate, they were having enough problems. The trouble started the moment Carmack had announced the previous year that the game design would be deathmatch only. In light of the success of Half-Life, a shooter in which story was everything, the free-for-all plan sounded heretical, if not out of touch. Others bristled at the notion that id's next title would be, essentially, its most elitist ever, not just suggesting that a player had a high-end machine, but requiring it by making the game compatible only for players who had 3D graphics cards installed. The fans weren't the only ones in doubt. After the office dysfunction that had surrounded Quake 2, the energy level heading into Quake 3 was at an all-time low. The old battles that Carmack had endured with Romero had been supplanted by the rest of the team. Inspired by Half-Life, everyone, it seemed, wanted a more ambitious design. But no matter what they came up with, Carmack shot it down. For Adrian, it was just more of the same. Further proof that after all these years since their lake house in Shreveport, id had become Carmack's company. Adrian felt frustrated, wanting to do something, anything that was different. It was a criticism that was starting to bubble up in the community as well. id was rehashing the same game over and over without any consideration for story and design. But Adrian resigned himself to go along. What was he going to do, he thought? Fire John Carmack? As work began on the project, the dissolution only festered. Carmack's intention to create a game that allowed the members of his company to work in, essentially, isolation, proved to be a bit too isolationist. As he churned out early versions of the Quake 3 engine, the mappers and artists felt adrift, with no direction on what to pursue. Left to their own devices, they simply created their own little worlds that clearly didn't relate to or complement each other. Carmack grew increasingly frustrated. Here he was, creating the most powerful graphics engine the company had ever seen, and no one on his staff seemed to be taking advantage of the opportunities. No one was pushing the technology, pushing the design, pushing him. Though Carmack never came out and said that he pined for the days of Romero's giddy experimentations, it was clear to him that something was missing. The magic of the self-motivated id Software team was gone. By February '99, the staff had had enough. Carmack clearly had no interest in managing the day-to-day affairs of the game. They wanted a producer. So Carmack called Graeme Devine. Graeme was a prodigy in gaming history. At 16, he was expelled from high school in England because he was spending too much time programming games for Atari. He later moved to the United States to co-found Trollobite, the company that produced one of the best-selling and most technologically impressive CD-ROMs of the early 90s, Seventh Guest. Graeme and Carmack had struck up a programmer's relationship along the way, corresponding often about the latest in coding. Now that it was time to bring on help for Quake 3, Carmack thought of Graeme, whose own company had recently gone under. Graeme was more than happy to come on board, but he was surprised at what he found. When he asked the 14 people what they thought the direction of the project was, he got 14 different answers. The night before his first day, 3 of the newer guys took him out for a coffee at Starbucks in Mesquite to prepare him for the bloody arena he was about to try and tame. "They are going to tell you that you have power," one explained, "but you will not have any power. They may say something's okay, but they will override your decisions." They warned Graeme of what to watch out for: the mind games, the politics, the people to distrust. Graeme wasn't swayed. "Everything's going to be okay," he assured them. "Don't worry, things will change." Nothing did. Graeme discovered that the egos at id were stronger than he surmised. Though people felt like they were working without direction, at the same time, no one really wanted to be told what to do. To make matters worse, a fundamental ingredient of the game, the bots, was missing. Bots were characters controlled by the computer. A good bot would blend in with the action and flesh of the scene like a robotic extra, as well as interact with the player. For Quake 3, a deathmatch-only game, bots were essential for single-player action. They were implicitly complex because they had to behave like human beings. Carmack had decided for the first time to delegate the job of creating these bots to another programmer in the company, but he failed to follow up. Once again, Carmack incorrectly assumed that everyone was as self-motivated and as adept as he was. He was wrong. When Graeme struggled to rein in the work, it was discovered that the bots were completely ineffective. They didn't behave at all like human beings. They behaved basically like bots. The staff began to panic. By March '99, they had reason to be scared. At the Game Developers Conference in San Jose, id employees got their first look at Unreal Tournament, a new game by Epic, the creators of the '98 shooter Unreal. Epic had quietly become formidable competition. Tim Sweeney, Epic's lead programmer, was revered. The company had even employed 2 former id guys, Jay Wilbur and Mark Rain, the probationary president from the Wolfenstein days, to handle business affairs. Unreal was a surprise hit, bringing, like Half-Life, more of a cinematic story feel to the genre. But their new game took id by even greater surprise. Unreal Tournament was a deathmatch-only multiplayer game, just like Quake 3. Epic, some thought, had flat out stolen id's idea. They resented the fact that Carmack, as usual, had been so open about the company's direction in his .plan file. But Epic denied stealing anything, saying that they'd only been on that track long before Carmack had announced it in his plan. The animosity and competition nevertheless remained, and with Quake 3 so disorganized, not to mention the heat of Columbine, there was no reprieve. Despite positive reviews of the game at E3, id began to fall apart. 2 respected young employees, Brandon James, a levels designer, and Brian Hook, a programmer, quit in frustration. Adrian separated from his wife, whom he had married during the height of Doom's success. Kevin, always the conciliatory owner, sensed that something had to be done. He asked Carmack to move out of his own office and share space with him and Adrian in hopes of improving communication. The move only intimidated the other employees, who couldn't help but wonder what was going on with their owners behind closed doors. What was going on, in fact, was nothing much. Instead of talking, the co-owners worked in silence. The only sound came when Carmack left and Adrian and Kevin turned up their stereo. By the end of the project, Gramey wasn't producing, he was programming. The bots were farmed out to a well-known mod maker in the Netherlands, who heroically brought them to life. The levels were stitched together in some sensible sequence. In November '99, the game was close enough to completion that some members of the company went on a promotional bus tour for the release. The fun was cut short, however, when they discovered that their competitor, Epic, had one-upped them again, releasing Unreal Tournament just a week before Quake 3 hit the shelves in early December. At the wire, the question remained: would players go with Carmack's or Epic's vision of plot-free, deathmatch-only, online world? Or would they stand by Romero, the beleaguered designer who was hoping to prove that Daikatana, in all its wild ambition, would save the story after all? Romero weighed in on the matter in a business preview of Quake 3 that appeared in Forbes. "Online gaming is still a small segment of the market," he told the magazine. "And the people who play over the web are the ones most likely to find sites where they can download the game for free." The magazine offered its own verdict of who would ultimately win the battle of the two Johns. "It's quite possible," the story concluded, "that id's far less grandiose strategy is the better one." "Rah!" Sean Green screamed as he thrashed his computer keyboard against the floor. It was midnight in the Coder's Cove of Ion Storm, and the cubes were as dark as the city below. Dressed in a black t-shirt, Romero's old friend hunched like an ape at the beginning of 2001, A Space Odyssey, as he whacked keys across the floor. A skinny programmer stretched his neck out of a nearby cube to observe the tantrum, then nonchalantly returned to his work. Sean brushed his hair back as a smile crept across his face. "Nothing like a little stress relief," he said, tossing the battered keyboard down the hall. Sean, like the others on the Daikatana team, was deep into crunch mode. Despite Romero's pledge years before to Carmack that his desk schedule days were over, he had upped the team's core hours to include weekends. The staff was now elbowing for bed space in the lounge. Brian Squirrel Iserloh had recently spent 85 out of 90 days without leaving the office. Several others were crawling to sleep under their blanket-shrouded cubicles, nestling on floors covered in loose M&Ms and pizza box pillows. Stevie Case was stuck home sick with a kidney infection. Romero had even taped a sign to the office's most popular arcade game that said, "No more Tekken 3 until Daikatana ships." Sean himself was about to take his first and only break in weeks, heading off to an abandoned abortion clinic to unwind with his death metal band, Last Chapter. After staring at lines of code all day and sucking down half a case of Mountain Dew, he was always looking for new ways to blow off steam and caffeine. He and Romero joked about making a life-size porcelain doll that would stand in the office holding a baseball bat. The punchline was that it held its own demise. So did Ion Storm by the fall of 1999. Romero's ship wasn't just off course. It was perched on a rock in a violent sea with a steady flow of crew members leaping, or pushing each other off. Reeling from Ion 8 departures, the Dallas Observer story, and the Columbine controversy, the company had suffered yet another blow at the result of that year's E3. The pressure going into the convention had been enormous, especially with the game promised this time for a December release. Todd confronted Romero before the event. "Look, Eidos is significantly concerned, and we need to have some sort of oversight. I need to make sure that things are coming along the way they're supposed to come along." He would get the game ready and send it to them at E3. Romero and Stevie showed up at E3 in May '99, looking the part of gaming's rock and roll royalty. Romero was in black leather pants, mesh black shirt, long silver chain. Stevie's bleach blonde hair spilled over a skin-tight baby blue shirt and black pants. Despite the bad press, they were besieged by the usual hordes of lustful boys and autograph-seeking Doom fanatics. When the disc of Daikatana's demo arrived, however, they didn't like what they saw. Bugs in the program were causing the game to chug slowly across the screen. Romero flew back to Dallas and stormed into the office of John Cavano, the Eidos representative who had been stationed to keep an eye on the company. "I'm fucking leaving," he told Cavano. "If Todd's going to stay here, I'm fucking gone. I can't work with this guy. He's ruining everything." Cavano told Romero a meeting would be called with Charles Cornwall, the owner of Eidos. "All you have to do," Cavano said, "is nod your head." In June, the Ion Storm partners Romero, Tom Hall, Todd Porter, and Jerry O'Flaherty flew to Los Angeles, ostensibly to talk with Eidos about buying out the majority of the company to relieve the owner's $30 million debt. Todd and Jerry quickly learned otherwise. "I'm sick of all this bullshit," Romero burst out. "Either Todd goes or I go." Cavano feigned incredulousness. "That's bullshit, John. You are Ion Storm. There's no decision here." Jerry knew what this was all about. Control. Romero wanted total control over his game. He tried haplessly to offer a solution. "If your problem is Todd working on your project," he said, "can we give Todd a project? Does anyone have a problem with that?" "Look," Romero said, "this is not a fun place to work anymore, and I think we need to take a partnership and go in a different direction." Before Jerry could suggest another option, to his surprise, Todd agreed. "Look," he said quietly, You're right, John. It's no fun for me either. It's clearly no fun for Jerry." Jerry acquiesced. They would go. The four owners walked out into the flash of light bulbs, but this time it wasn't for them. It was for actors Heather Graham and Rob Lowe, who were there for a photo shoot. Ultimately, Todd and Jerry were happy to be getting what would surely be a healthy buyout for a company that seemed to be going down the tubes. Romero and Tom were relieved to have a new beginning. Maybe the company would be saved by the games, but either way, they all still believed in their original vision. That design, that the games could be law. The problem, as Romero said, was that the design didn't take into account technology, and it didn't take into account that the designer doesn't necessarily know how to manage. In October, after reporting a loss of $44.8 million, Eidos announced that it was purchasing 51% of Ion Storm. Romero spent the fall buckling down on the game. The interview requests were turned away. Tekken 3 remained unplugged. Though the monsters, levels, sound, and art were nearing completion, there was a formidable task ahead. Burning through the remaining bugs, all 500 of them, in time for their promised December 17th, 1999 release. But Eidos was confident enough to schedule a release party for that day, despite Romero's objections. The party came, but without a finished Daikatana game. Not until April 21st, 2000, would Romero finally feel ready to release it. The next day, he sat down at his computer and typed a message for readers on the internet. "My God, it's finally finished," he wrote. "And I thought working on a game for 1.5 years was long. Wow, I wish everyone would take a nice, objective look at the game and not base their criticisms on hype, but on play value and what we've worked hard to achieve. A really fun, single-player experience." Romero tried to dissuade the inevitable comparisons with its former company. "We did not," he wrote, "develop Daikatana to take on Quake 3. But the final score was out of his hands.